haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr. Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups.
Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
Welcome to Cult Chat. It is great. We've got a full studio today and we're pretty excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Andre Jackson. Now, Kaz and Lindy, you haven't yet been involved in any of my discussions with Dr. Andre Jackson. However, you did comment at the end of episode 2 because you have heard the 2 parts conversation I've had with him around the Jehovah Witnesses. So today we're pretty excited to be inviting him here to talk about some research and the waking up concept. So Lindy, it's pretty exciting because you get to chat to Dr. Andre today, and Kaz and I are ahead of you. We met him in Barcelona. So a nice opportunity now for us all to say a hello to each other.
Yeah. Lovely to see you, Andre. It's so nice to see you again. Last time was Barcelona for me. So welcome to our space.
Yeah, and
thank you so much.
It's amazing to be able to meet you, Andre, and I've just so appreciated listening in on the interviews that Liz has done with you so far. And I want to say a huge thank you for all of the incredible research and work that you've done into, all these things that we're about to talk about. Because, as someone who is a victim of shunning and who has gone through, that whole thing of waking up, it's so validating, and it means so much to have, backed up, qualitative and quantitative research in these areas that go, you're not alone. This is the thing. This, we can get research on this. We can collect the stories. We hear you. So thank you for all your work.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you so much for having me on here. It's an honor, and I look forward to speaking with you.
Brilliant. So I think the way we'll rumble today is we'll ask Andre to just introduce himself a little bit, and then let's get a wee scaffold there for how the conversation might unfold. I think he's going to look into the context of the research, which fits within the Jehovah Witness Bethelite community group. So there's something of real interest there. Probably many people aren't aware of the Bethelites. And then we'll be looking at some of the themes of the research and then digging into the chronology and the stages of waking up. So it should be so interesting. So Andre, why don't you take it away with how do you describe yourself?
Oh boy, yeah. Well, I just finished my research, my degree in business psychology, and people may think it's a little unexpected maybe that somebody who studies business psychology would research cults and cult-related topics. But my chair actually encouraged me. She says, hey, listen, a cult is an organization. You may think of them as a business. It's all about how groups influence individuals. It's all about social psychology. And encouraged me and said she would have my she would have my back. She would support me. We approached our department head, who also agreed. And they were actually 2 of the 3 people on my committee. So it was not something that I hadn't expected. I was originally going to research something a little different. But I had a few conversations with my chair and said, this is my background. This is something I'm really passionate about and about which I do a lot of research as it is. And she's like, well, why don't you combine your passion with the useful and do your research in that space?
That's amazing. Can you remind our listeners who may not yet have listened to our part 1 and part 2 interviews with you about the Jehovah Witnesses, although they're going to probably now jump over and do that before progressing into this episode? Do you just mind giving us a wee hint of your background and your link into this particular topic?
Yeah, so I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. I wasn't technically born into it. My mom started studying with witnesses when I was 4 years old and became a baptized member of the Jehovah's Witnesses when I was 7. So I have a few very vague, hazy memories of non-Jehovah's Witness related activities like Christmas trees over Christmas. But really the change for me occurred when I was very young, which is why I often, talk about myself as having grown up and having been raised as a witness.
And obviously somewhere along the line, there was a waking up process for you, a little bit complicated.
Yes. Yeah.
That story unfold as we talk today, or?
Yeah, I mean, I can work that in. It was really interesting as I was analyzing the stories in my research, how I recognized parts of my own story in their stories. Because I was really looking for like a shared chronology, like are people having the same experience? What are the stages of their experience? How do they describe it? And yeah, like there were frequently moments where I'm like, yeah, I recognize this. I recognize what you're talking about. And sometimes it was very specific, like even the actual doubt or the actual criticism, like, yeah, that's the exact question, doubt, or criticism that I had myself. So yeah, as we talk about it, I can sort of work in my personal angle and talk a little bit about my own personal waking up journey as well.
Could you describe the actual research study, like the what?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I did a qualitative analysis. I did a narrative inquiry. So that means that I analyzed the stories. How do people talk about an experience, about a phenomenon, right? So they all lived through this thing that they refer to as waking up, and it wasn't clearly defined, not in the literature. And people, say on Reddit or on social media, will describe it in their own different ways, but there was not necessarily a shared understanding as to what is this. So you talk about this experience, you say like, I woke up, but like, what is waking up? So that was part of what I was trying to determine, right? Like, what is this experience?
No, it is a really helpful term. It's easy to remember. Like, there's so many, it's tricky, isn't it? The language, like you've talked about that around what language do you use? What language do we use for shunning? Because each group has got a different one. And obviously waking up is a phrase that's been popularly used by ex-JWs. It's becoming more popularized, which is really useful. And I think, chunks of research like yours on it that people refer back to, it's really helpful because it's a lot easier to say waking up than disaffiliation or some of those other words that are fantastic words, but they're quite a mouthful. And yeah, everyone can, like the public can grasp waking up, what that means very easily.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Like when I started off and I looked into existing deconversion models and the terminology they use, it's not necessarily intuitive or easily understandable, and people use the same word in different ways sometimes, and it's not always. I mean, and like I just noticed, like witnesses, just that's the terminology they use because that's what the experience feels like to them.
Yeah,
They're like, whoa, like, and there's other metaphors that often come up around water, like drowning and being flooded, and so like to me that was part of the curiosity, like, okay, what do people mean when they say that? Because I thought I knew what waking up meant, but like that doesn't mean that you mean the same thing when you say it. Initially I started with the assumption that that's when people realize they're in a cult, and that's how they describe the realization that they're in a cult and their exit from a cult. And it turned out that in the data that I had, there was no evidence to support that necessarily. People did not necessarily talk about realizing they were in a cult. However, the language that they used implicitly referred to cults. They would talk about brainwashing and undue influence and other phenomena that are associated with cults and cult-like organizations, which is why I made an adjustment to my preliminary definition of what waking up was, what I thought it was, as to more of a detection of systemic manipulation. Like they all realized, and in their stories, they all talked about realizing that they had been manipulated and that they rejected the organization that had been doing that to them.
That's really fascinating. And yeah, thanks for highlighting that, because I know in a lot of my experience has been to do with the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, people who have left that, which is similar kind of high control Christian based organization. But that thing about the word cult is so fascinating, because there are so many people who leave, and it's not for months or years afterwards that they actually come to the place of naming, using the C word. And yet, as you say, there's definitely been a process of waking up and to the point of leaving and real unhappiness and rejection of the organization. And yet it can take people a long time to kind of, for whatever reason, accept that terminology or to use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's probably different ways. I mean, that's not what I researched, why that happens. I can only speculate, but I think to a degree, there's maybe a little bit of inoculation. When you go to the Jehovah's Witnesses website, and I think that's something I mentioned in the past, they actually have a page and say, like, our Jehovah's Witnesses a cult, and then they provide their own definition. They don't meet the definition as a result, and most witnesses are familiar with that. So they're like, well, that's not what it is, but that's not necessarily what matters, right? Like what matters is what they're doing to you, what kind of organization it is, that there's undue control, undue influence, abuse, and yeah, but like you said, as a result, sometimes it takes a long time until people have the realization that, yeah, that actually meets the criteria of being a cult.
And so you landed on the word systematic manipulation as being key, right? Like that's what your PhD's in. So systematic manipulation. Can you unpack what those two words mean in particular? Why did you choose them in particular, as opposed to undue influence or high control or that sort of thing?
Yeah. So the idea of systemic manipulation is what I use to define the meaning of waking up for the participants in my study. So the systemic part is because it's a group, right? There's different people that contribute to the manipulation that is exerted on the members. And it's insidious because that influence, that control, that manipulation may come from people who themselves are being manipulated. Right, so you may be manipulated by somebody who's not aware. They're not necessarily doing that consciously, knowingly, or on purpose. Right, like my mom is convinced that this is the truth. Right, my mom doesn't see anything negative or suspicious or insidious about what she's done to my sister and me, and the people she's trying to recruit. So hence the systemic part, because it's a systemic influence. And the manipulation is because at the end of the waking up process, which we'll talk about later, the turning point when people decided to walk away from this group was often a result of determining that they had been lied to and that they had been deceived, which is why I use the term manipulation, because it seems that recognizing that there is that you've been manipulated. It's not necessarily a disagreement or moral outrage. Like these can contribute to the process. But in my study, it was usually the realization that, I've been deceived, I've been lied to, I've been manipulated. And that sort of seems to, trigger something that makes people walk away.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay.
Tell us about the context of your research, like the group of people that you use some of their narratives.
Yeah, so I studied Bethelites, Jehovah's Witnesses Bethelites. Those are people who, have volunteered to typically live on the compound. Jehovah's Witnesses operate numerous of these compounds around the world. There's around 23,000 volunteers that live in these compounds. Some are commuters that live like in the vicinity and just, drive to work. But the Bethelites that typically people have in mind when they talk about Bethelites, and the ones that I researched, were people who actually lived on these compounds. And the reason why was I was curious about this waking up process, and the origin behind that was that as I was waking up and I was exposed to certain things where I'm like, okay, that doesn't seem true. In particular, it doesn't seem true. It seems deceptive. Somebody's trying to do something to me. When I would raise these points to some of my friends who were Jehovah's Witnesses, to some of them, those were not problems at all. They're like, they didn't care. It didn't matter to them. So I was curious as to, how come that some items become issues for believers and trigger a deconversion, an onset of disbelief, a disaffection, a disillusionment, but for others it doesn't. And then I was curious, among Jehovah's Witnesses, the Bethelites are, I guess, in a, if you consider Jehovah's Witnesses as a high control group, and there's a high degree of control being exerted on these members. For Bethelites, that degree of control is even higher because they do live on the compound. So they're even more isolated. They're financially dependent on the organization. They're more controlled literally. I mean, there's stories of people like they live. It's essentially dormitories for a lot of people, unless you're a married couple, then you share, a bedroom or like an apartment with your spouse. But for the unmarried Bethelites, they typically share rooms, and there's a room service that comes in, I think, every day and makes up the room. And those people will check for certain things. I don't know if that happens as a regular occurrence, but there's certainly stories out there where people would find unapproved literature or stains in the bed sheets, things like that. And that level of control doesn't apply to regular witnesses. So I was curious, like, okay, so there's people who live under such tight control, who are so dedicated that they forfeit their own personal ambition because they think this is the best thing they can do, like dedicate their life entirely to God, live on this compound, and that's what they do. And yet there are some people who are in Bethel and wake up. So like, to me, that was like the epitome of like, okay, this really shouldn't happen, like, but it does. How come?
I want to quote you back to you. Can I do that? I found my notes from your talk, and I was really captured by the distinction you made right at the beginning of your talk at the conference in Barcelona about the difference between disillusionment and disaffection. And you've already mentioned those words just today. You said disillusionment was a cognitive disengagement that disrupts or destroys belief, and disaffection is an emotional withdrawal which breaks the hold of the group over the person. Does that sound like something you might have said?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. And I found it really helpful that you explained those terms right at the beginning, because we just think, oh, wake up, walk away, there you go, all over. But those terms helped me to think of more complexity around the stepping away from the belief.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting. I did a lot of research into witnesses, the control mechanisms, and then later on in the process of doing the literature review for my PhD, I came across the literature for religious deconversion. And I saw there's models out there and terminology that describes the process of people changing their belief. And I thought it was very useful to have the vocabulary to describe certain parts of the experience. It's very useful, to be able to distinguish different types of experiences. I expected that they would also like feed into the chronology, and I think they typically do among witnesses. I think there's usually first a disillusionment before the disaffection happens, but it doesn't have to be the case. Sometimes that order is reversed. Sometimes it's really just in parallel. But either way, it's useful to, I guess, have an understanding and have a little bit of granularity.
Could you talk to our listeners just about PIMO, POMO, so well used sort of phrases within the Jehovah Witness sector when considering people who are leaving? If you can explain that for us, that might help understand when we get onto the stages what's going on.
Sure. So the PIMO phenomenon, PIMO is an acronym that stands for physically in, mentally out. that's a result of what may be considered the exit costs, right? So there is somebody in a high control group, but is maybe not a believer anymore, or has other reasons why they would like to disaffiliate themselves from the group. But there's a cost to this. And in terms of cults, it's usually the social cost, right? Like you lose your family, you lose your friends, you're being ostracized. So that results in people that remain affiliated to the group, like ostensibly being believers. They do everything that they're supposed to do, and it may not be apparent to other members that this is not an authentic believer anymore. So they're physically still in. They go to the meetings, they go recruiting, they do the work, whatever it may be, but mentally they're not bought in anymore. And among witnesses, that is a frequent phenomenon, because often witnesses have family members who are also witnesses, and they know that they may lose their parents, their children, their siblings, and so often they pretend. And among the participants in my research, there were people who pretended to be believing witnesses for several years until they were at the point where they're like, okay, now I can announce to my family that I actually don't believe this anymore.
Do you think, on that note, that a high number of PIMO people are possibly second generation or multi-generation, and that they haven't chosen to join as adults? They were born in, so they may not necessarily have ever really kind of owned the beliefs as their own in the first place. Do you think that there's a high number of those among the PIMO people who are just like, heck, I was born here, I didn't have a choice, but how do I get out? And that they can tend to stay in for longer, wrestling with that?
I guess they could be. The tricky thing is I haven't seen any research on PIMOs, and I think it's because it's, the moment people stand up and say like, yeah, I'm a PIMO, well, they've just outed themselves, right?
They're now a PIMO.
Exactly.
That would be fascinating to know, if there's anyone out there looking for a research topic, is around that first gen, multi-gen or second gen, and if they tend to, around that differences. I know you, Liz, have talked at Gloria Vale before about how people can go either way if they're second gen or multi-gen, that they can either, have that kind of PIMO thing of being like, actually, I'm not very zealous and I never chose this and I don't really believe it. Or they can swing the wheel right the other way and end up becoming the most zealous and the most fervent because it's all they know, and they're like, they're fully indoctrinated from the get-go. They've never known any other life, and they can become really extreme in their embrace of the ideology. So it's interesting, around, what's to say, who goes either way. And can I ask, Andre, have you got any siblings that have remained in?
I have not, no. My stepsister was never baptized Jehovah's Witness, left, moved out, and announced that she wasn't really a believer when I was 14 years old. Right. And as a result, I didn't talk to my sister for, I want to say, about 20 years, maybe a little over 20 years, because growing up, she was like a bad girl. Like, we never visited my sister. My sister had 3 children. Some of them had health issues, hospital stays. We would never go and support my sister, visit, nothing like that. And she wasn't even baptized.
There's so many costs, so much loss, hey? The reason I asked that is because I'm the third of 6 children, and 2 of the 6 are out. And all the time I have people saying to me, why did you leave? And why did your brother leave? And why not the rest of your siblings? What is it? And I really struggle to answer that question. What is it that means some people wake up and some people don't?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Right? That's good.
All right.
Yeah, so what were the themes and the stages? What is this process of waking up?
So in the narratives I analyzed, I recognized certain similarities. The first one that really surprised me was not even a stage of waking up yet, but sort of the background, which was that everybody had doubts, which surprised me because like growing up, I was never considered a very spiritual Jehovah's Witness. Like I always had like, worldly friends and, went to college and, pursued a career. So I was never really a tip-top witness. And I always looked at the ostensibly good witnesses, the ones that are accepted, not only the ones that want to go to Bethel, but the ones that are accepted. There's a very rigorous screening and application process. And I was really surprised that people would go to Bethel and then like later on share their story and say like, yeah, actually I had a number of doubts, things that didn't make sense to me. I'm like, okay. Because criticism and doubts are suppressed, right? So you go to all these meetings, you meet all your fellow believers, and you would never know that they have doubts because nobody talks about it.
Not safe to talk about it. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, like I think there's different metaphors. I think the Mormons talk about putting it on a shelf. Like if they don't have answers, just put it on a shelf and let it be. Witnesses talk about waiting on Jehovah, right? Like we don't have answers now, or maybe you don't understand it right now, but eventually that understanding may come. And even if it doesn't, is it really that important? So there's different mechanisms for people to avoid engaging with their doubts and their questions and their criticisms, which is a big deal, right? Like as long as that works and people manage to avoid thinking about it or convince themselves it's been resolved, they can happily continue believing.
Yeah, whether it's busying them with general busyness or whether it's entertaining them to death. There are some people who believe that in the Brethren, for example, there's allegedly a really high rate of alcohol consumption and things like that, right? Where there's so many different ways that we can distract ourselves from those doubts. Or as you say, there's like kind of theological reasons given to, like again in the Brethren, people were encouraged, if you don't have enough faith, pin your faith onto that of the leader. It's like sort of ways to kind of even spiritually bypass it, I guess, spiritually whitewash the issue and find a way around it. Yeah.
There's a good chance that the group will say, if you have doubts, that it's just an indication that you're lacking in spirituality.
Yes.
And to remedy this, what you need to do is do more for the group.
Right.
And then people just get busy and don't have time to think about it or just gaslit into believing that the problem is with them. There's nothing wrong with whatever doubt or concern they may have. It's really just them. Yeah. That's something that was borne out in my research. Like a lot of people, like that's how they managed some of their doubts. They really just thought it was them.
Wow.
I've heard that from a lot of people inside Gloryvale, even those who were abused. They're like, I thought I was the only one and I took it all upon myself, that I was clearly in the wrong. Terrible.
So is it just general doubts we're talking about here, or are we talking about something that sort of bubbles up to the surface as more of an event maybe?
So the way other researchers have sort of categorized doubt is, or the way I look at it is, it doesn't necessarily have to be doubt. It could be a criticism or moral outrage or exhaustion, right? Which is when we go into like the disaffection, where people don't necessarily take issue with the dogma or with what the leader said. They're just so exhausted to the point that they don't care anymore, right? So there's different ways that can happen. Among the people that I looked at, it was predominantly something cognitive, I think. I had 6 participants in my study. So everything I say, like none of this can be generalized to either Bethelites, witnesses, or other cult members. It just helps elucidate the process for this particular population, and it gives insights, but this was not a quantitative study. But yeah, so the initial doubt event that they had was sometimes moral outrage, where they observed something that just didn't feel right to them, where they knew this isn't right. One case, it was exhaustion. It was a disappointment because the expectations are so high at Bethel. Like you're so close to, the people that are being used by God to steer His organization on earth, and you observed something that's like, yeah, no, this is outrageous or disappointing.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it was really just a disagreement, like, oh, this isn't true. This isn't right. So it can be different things.
So, all right, shall we have a chat about the next stages coming up where you're talking about sort of initial events and trigger events? What do these look like?
The initial doubt event, exactly. So like I just sort of started touching on, the initial doubt event is, in retrospective, the first instance of somebody saying like, oh, hold on, something either isn't right or doesn't feel right. The disillusionment versus the disaffection. That doesn't seem to be necessarily apparent at the time it happens. It may be, but in some instances, it's something that people only recognize after the fact. I'm like, oh yeah, hold on. This was the first time I actually thought, no, like, this is not, there's no Holy Spirit here at work. This is not being guided by God, like something, and sometimes they're caught up in the routine, or they're busy, or somebody's trying to help them manage these doubts and concerns. But it's still after the fact, the first time where somebody's like, yeah, this is, something isn't right. And like in my own personal story, it was interesting. I was in Germany visiting my mom, and we went to a meeting, because it doesn't matter if you're on vacation, you go to the meeting. And we were there, and it was on a Sunday, and the brother, the Jehovah's Witness who gives the sermon, the talk, was talking about a prophecy and how it all had come true, was fulfilled in all details, and how this city was destroyed and never rebuilt and never found and not inhabited. And I'm like, I thought I heard about the city in the news. So after the meeting, I just pulled out my phone and just looked it up. And like, yeah, it's right there. And it's like, okay, so this guy either hadn't done a minimum amount of research to actually know what he was talking about, or he had knowingly lied to us. Either way, it was a problem. And this was sort of when I started giving myself permission to look into things a little bit further when they didn't sound just right.
Excellent. So in the Barcelona conference, you then spoke about a trigger event that was associated with an action. What's that stage about?
So, yeah, like the word trigger implies, right? So it was something that gave the impetus to people to do something about this doubt or criticism that they had, which was typically do research. So it was usually, from the group's perspective, well-intentioned. They tried to resolve the doubt. They were convinced that there was an answer, a satisfactory answer, and they could reconcile things. And I think that is a key bit, because it's unintentional and it's well-intentioned, which is why people then allow themselves to do research, because they're convinced they're going to find an answer. And then sometimes it happens that the answer sort of discredits or undermines what they believe. Like, it doesn't fix the doubt, but it makes it worse. That's the unsuccessful doubt resolution. That's the next step. So the trigger causes people to do research. People try to resolve it. And then as they try to resolve it, they realized that they were not the only ones that had these questions. So the unsuccessful attempt to resolve doubt was, like I said, it was well-intentioned. People were confident they were going to find an answer, but they were not successful. And the interesting thing about this is that this is not a neutral event as far as their belief and their faith is concerned. If you have a doubt and you cannot find a satisfying answer, it usually grows, like it becomes more of a problem, because you should be able to resolve this. And realizing that you're not in the process of doing research to try and find the answers. When you find out that other people have the same question, certainly now in the day and age of the internet, when you can just try and maybe Google this and see, like, when did this happen, or what do other people think about this, and you realize that there's other people who have the same problem. That is very powerful when it comes to overcoming the gaslighting. Like I said early on, usually there's an attempt to make people believe the problem is they themselves, a lack of spirituality, a lack of faith. When they realize that, hold on, there's a whole lot of people, we all have the same problem. Like we don't understand because maybe this doesn't make sense. I was trying to convince myself that it would, but like apparently nobody. If I go around asking people to help me resolve this and nobody can, well, then it's not my spirituality, right? So this was like a key event in this chronology of waking up is people actually engaging with their doubt.
Yes. So that can sometimes look like having a doubt about the leader. Perhaps they've been told about his past and they haven't believed it. I think in the context of Gloriavale, where their previous leader has gone to prison for offending, but it's been told to the people in Gloriavale that he's there for persecution. They've heard these little rumours through the grapevine. They've suppressed the doubts for a long time, but then perhaps they start asking other people. Perhaps they get themselves on Google and all of a sudden that the doubts are rearing their heads. And so what you're saying is people then often try to resolve that doubt. And that might for them look like going to a leader, being brave enough to go and say, goodness, I've heard these things about the leader. Is this true? Perhaps then being lied to and realise they're being lied to, unsuccessful doubt resolution, then they find themselves on the outside. They're done. It's over. And they just thought they were resolving a genuine doubt they had. They were still what they would have called loyal members up to that point.
Yeah, there's this great example from a woman who was a key member who started up the Centrepoint community about how she was approaching the leader, Bert Potter, in prison and trying to sort of negotiate with him about his basically child sex ideology, and bringing in research that she was learning about in the social sector space about safety and child abuse kind of domain, and kind of sort of slowly the penny was dropping as she was genuinely engaging with him, thinking that actually he just didn't know this stuff, that actually it wasn't making any difference. And in fact, the change was not possible from within, but actually it was something far more systemic and problematic than just a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge. Yeah, the penny slowly dropping that this is not right, actually.
And you said, Andre, that it builds. And one of the phrases I wrote down was that people start consuming apostate material. And obviously, they're reading things and finding out things and going to sources that the group deems unacceptable. You spoke about the Bethelites' rooms potentially being searched. They're looking for who's feeding information because part of a cult restricts information coming to your ears.
Yeah, information control is a really, really big thing at Bethel. I've heard stories about the internet traffic being monitored, right? Like I said, people checking I don't know necessarily if they check, but they will take note, right? So if you have a magazine in your room like that, for outsiders may be a benign thing about entertainment downtown, right? But like if there's anything lurid in there or something questionable, or morally, not on the strict white side of things, conforming with the purity culture, you may be reported and that can become a problem. So it's not even necessarily a moment, like the period of time when people try and resolve these doubts. Two things typically happen. For one, they realize they're not alone in their doubt. There's other people who share these questions and concerns. And the other thing that often happens is that they find more things that are problematic for them because they allow themselves to actually consume what the outside world says, maybe read a newspaper article about witnesses, maybe watch a documentary, maybe engage with people who have left who share this concern and then well, did you know about this? Have you heard about this? Which is, like in my case, it's exactly what happened, right? So I had, after this moment when I'm like, okay, this guy either didn't know what he was talking about or he was purposefully deceptive or he just didn't care enough. I started paying more attention to the things that were being said and sort of built a list of things where I'm like, okay, I don't really have a good answer for this, right? And I was a proper believer. I thought it all made sense. And then I realized, well, there's more and more things that don't make sense. And often it was just a matter of looking up a scientist or an author that had been quoted, and I just Googled that person, looked up the original quote, and I saw that things had been left out to make a quote misleading or give the impression that this scientist was saying something that he actually wasn't saying. So I started compiling this list, and I sent it to Bethel. And I said, listen, I've tried to talk to the brothers, I've prayed about it, I've done my research, but I cannot answer these questions. Can you please help me? And the first time they answered my letter, they responded, but they didn't provide satisfying answers. But in the meantime, I'd compiled another list. So I sent a second letter. And the second time, they forwarded the letter on to the elders, the leaders of my local congregation. So I had two men knock on my door and pay me a visit. They invited me to a meeting with them at the Kingdom Hall, and we talked, right? And he doesn't know because I've never talked to him again. At the end of the meeting, he said he did not want to meet with me ever again to talk about the Bible, which was my turning point. I'm like, well, clearly then this is not about the Bible and true belief in God. This is about something else. And like, if you consider yourself a shepherd of the flock and you knock on strangers' doors, people who don't want to be bothered, you bother them. And here I am, the proverbial lost sheep. I just have questions. I want to believe. And you're giving me an attitude and you don't want to talk to me? Well, then I realized something was really not right about this.
Yeah, wow. There's so much overlap there, Andre, with my own personal experiences. And also, can I ask on that, approximately how old you were? You don't need to give an exact age, but were you a young person? Or, because I'm just thinking about that power dynamic of you meeting alone with two spiritual authorities, and how that in itself, there's a big power imbalance there that is not very safe, potentially. Like, you're quite vulnerable, someone meeting with two elders, it's a very vulnerable position to be in.
That's a good point. Yeah. It's very interesting. So this happened when I was in my mid to late 30s. And I mean, these are two men that I've known for years. One of them was a personal friend of mine. Like, we would hang out and, play board games or go to the movies. The interesting thing is, because of some aspects of my background of having pursued higher education and having somewhat of a career and having somewhat of the ability to be independent. Like, I'm not materially dependent on the group, and I've traveled a lot. I've met a lot of different people and have had exposure to different cultures. And I've observed also how certain aspects of how Jehovah's Witnesses are and what's accepted, what's not, is different between different countries. All that helped me to have a degree of independence.
Yeah.
So when we're in this meeting, and it was really interesting, because I think elders, the men in charge of the congregation, I think are kind of used to this power that they have. And I don't think this elder expected me to openly disagree with him and to call him out on the things that didn't make sense. I said, like, you're doing mental gymnastics. This makes no sense what you're saying.
Wow.
And he really was taken aback a little bit. And I think that's maybe a reason why he said he doesn't want to meet with me anymore, because I'm so rebellious. But I'm like, well, listen, like, if you don't have an answer, that's okay. Like, I don't have the answers to everything, but it becomes a problem when you tell me things that are obviously not true.
Yeah.
So when you were just talking about this, you used the phrase the turning point. And that was something that you mentioned in your talk, this sort of moment.
Yes.
And you also emphasized that the turning point, which you've just described really nicely for that moment for you, wasn't the same thing as the trigger point. And you said that they weren't actually necessarily closely connected in time. And I found that really interesting. You get triggered, but it could be years before you have that turning moment, which is...
And the turning point leads to your ultimate leaving or rejection of or expulsion from. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Very interesting. So when I started drawing up the chronology, I'm like, okay, is there a point distinguishing between the trigger point and the turning point, the trigger point and the turning point? And yes, because the amount of time spent by people trying to resolve doubts sometimes takes a long, long time. Sometimes they may be able to successfully resolve a doubt or think they've successfully resolved a doubt, but maybe doing the research, something else popped up, and then now it's something else, which is also a reason why sometimes the nature of the doubt or the criticism changes between the two. In the case of the witnesses in my study, the turning point was always related to detecting deception and to a disagreement around the dogma. So often it was like, okay, that's not true, so I disagree with it as a result. But the previous point that triggered them doing research sometimes was different in nature. Sometimes it was about disappointment or an emotional outrage.
How they saw someone else being treated.
Exactly, that kind of thing. So that may cause somebody to start doing research to resolve things, but then as they do research, they find different things out, and sometimes those things are even worse.
Yeah.
And sometimes that lead to the turning point. And my turning point was, like I said, when I was told that my elder wouldn't want to meet with me to talk about the Bible, but in that conversation, they brought up CSA, child sexual abuse, which had not even popped up in my research, because I just tried to resolve the doubts that I had, which were mostly doctrinal. I had questions about the Bible, not about the leadership, not about court cases, not about United Nations membership, not about the Australian Royal Commission. Like, I was like, okay, the flood, did that happen? When was Tyre actually destroyed? Like, it was all very biblical. But in this conversation, they brought child sexual abuse up. I'm like, okay, why? And then I started doing some research. I'm like I had no idea. And it sort of like sealed the case for me, like, not only is your intention, what you're doing, not what you prefer it to be, but there are like serious problems with the organization itself, like cults being cults, and I guess how you're being socialized, or like what you permit yourself to ask, and to the type of questions you allow yourself to have. I think among witnesses, that seems to typically be the case. Like, I had questions about the Bible, the veracity of the Bible, certain events, like especially when there's like a conflict with science, right? Like, is evolution a thing, yes or no? How old is the earth, I did not allow myself to question or critique the organization. Like, first for me was the Bible. Then like, okay, so if that's gone on, like, what about this character of God in the Bible? And that was still okay. Like, I allowed myself to like question certain things. And it wasn't until way, way later that I'm like, hold on, the organization, there's things wrong with the organization.
You said something interesting in Barcelona. You've said it again here today, though, that it's often not a moral outrage. It's not that group members necessarily find out that the man leading their organization has committed a crime or is not infallible after all. And that really stuck with me. I could never work out why people in Gloriavale could just keep going on, even though there's all this morality issues. But you said moral outrage is rarely enough to be the sole turning point. It was always around lies, realizing you were lied to, manipulation, or doctrinal differences, or perhaps you got ousted because you're asking questions.
And the idea that if they've lied to you about this, what else are they lying to you about? Like, to me, the foundation will be pulled out from under you if you can no longer trust the basic facts anymore. Because, like the group I was involved in, Centrepoint, like, there was widespread in-your-face abuse, sexual abuse, and like everyone just sort of tolerated it as it got worse and worse and worse. So much moral outrage that no one did anything about, which is hard for people to understand. But I think your description here of the distrust of the organisation and the deception, it rings true to me as well in a different context.
Yeah, I think this is speculation. Like, this is not something that I did research. It's just something that I observed, right, among the participants in my study. In some instances, there was moral outrage, and it contributed to the process, but it was not sufficient to lead them to their turning point. It led them to like, let's do more research, or maybe I don't want to be here anymore, but I still believe. It wasn't until they came to the point of detecting deception and disagreeing with the doctrine that they left.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end of our chat with you, Andre, and I just wanted to sum up a few of your points and then ask you if you had any final reflections. You've looked through the stages of waking up, and you've come across and you've presented to us the concepts of having doubts. People have doubts, often a long time prior to them leaving, but they suppress their doubts. Perhaps they put them on a shelf or put their head in the sand. There's always an initial, there's waking up events that occur or trigger events that lead to some action where they actually try to actively resolve their doubt, but there's usually unsuccessful doubt resolution. That one's really gripped me. And then they may begin consuming apostate material in an attempt to sort of resolve doubt or find out more information. And they're often finding out there are others with similar doubts. And then they may find out the turning point really comes where they realize they've been lied to. It may couple with some moral outrage, and they find themselves leaving the organization. And some people over time, there's just disillusionment and disaffection part of alongside and partway through the journey. But are they the key elements of the waking up process?
Yeah, in the chronology that I observed, maybe two additions. The unsuccessful doubt resolution, sometimes people are able to resolve some of their doubt, which means the trigger event was not a trigger event, right? Well, it was a trigger, but it doesn't lead to a turning point, right? Sometimes people are able to resolve and work through things, and then either maybe they manage to ignore it, or they think they come to a resolution. Maybe there is an answer. Sometimes there may be a genuine answer that resolves their doubt or their criticism. And the apostate information that you had mentioned, right? So that was really interesting because in my study, all these were not witnesses that were trying to find something wrong with the organization, right? They didn't set out trying to debunk it or have some bad motivation or intention. They were genuinely trying to find answers. It was only, I guess, as a result of either frustration because they'd spent so much time and didn't find satisfying answers, or by accident that they came across apostate information and gave themselves permission to read it in most cases. And there's one particular participant who, as part of his duties at Bethel, had to read apostate information or information that could have been apostate. And that was a really interesting journey for him, and that triggered some of his doubts. He read this, like, is this right? Is this true? And then he talked to others and it turns out we don't know. And but yeah, so I think one of the big takeaways for me is because some of these participants now are activists, right? Like one of them runs jwfacts.com, right? It's one of the biggest websites that people recommend and go to educate themselves about Jehovah's Witnesses. That was not their goal as they set out, right? They were believers. So one other point I want to make at the end, like in terms of the practical implications of my study, was that it was key for people to actually engage with their doubt, right? Because they're gaslit to think that the fault is with them. Sometimes they're being told, sure, what you have observed here, these are the members and they're flawed, but the organization is led by God. It's the most perfect organization run by imperfect people. So my recommendation when it comes to helping people who are still in cultic groups is to encourage them to take agency, to engage with their doubt, like remind them that they're smart enough to understand certain things. And if something doesn't make sense, well, maybe because it doesn't, not because they're not smart enough or they're not spiritual enough, right? If they feel disappointment, that maybe that is justified, right? If they feel moral outrage, that maybe that deserves to be moral outrage, to not suppress their outrage. So for people to feel empowered to engage with their doubts, with their criticisms. And when you think about it, if this truly was the truth, they wouldn't have to worry that somebody actually engages and tries to resolve doubts and questions that they have, right? The truth doesn't have to worry, it doesn't fear criticism and scrutiny, right? So if somebody's not sure if the group they're associated with is cultic or not, and they're they're instructed to not engage with doubts and criticism, then I think that's probably a red flag, because, things that are true don't have to worry about this.
That last comment there, that the truth isn't afraid of scrutiny, that's really challenging. That's amazing. Thank you. Well, that's been really interesting, and I'm sure those who've come from cultic backgrounds have been following along and tracking through the stages. And Lindy, we haven't heard a whole lot of reflections on you on this, but I'm sure over our next few episodes there'll be probably references to this waking up stages as you contemplate how it's impacted you and led you out of the exclusive brethren. So thanks to our listeners. Thank you, Andre. It's been really interesting being with you for these last 3 episodes. We're grateful for the time you've given. You're, an international man, and we're all here coming together because you've got something really important to share. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Yeah.
Thanks for having me again. It was great talking with you. And I know it's taken up a lot of time, so I appreciate that. And I don't know if I can or should say that for people who are curious or want to read more, like my study's publicly available on ResearchGate. You can Google Andre Jackson Waking Up and you'll find it. There's also the presentation I gave in Barcelona is on that same site, and it's publicly available.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks to our listeners for joining in today. Don't forget that we're on various platforms. You can like us, leave comments on our YouTube channel. You can email us now at info@cultchat.org.nz, and head on social media, thumbs up, share us around, because it's such an important message that we're getting out there, trying to encourage others to cult-proof their lives. Thanks, everyone. Join us again for our next episode soon. Bye, everyone.
See you later.
Bye.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.